Hey everybody, Questwise here, and today we're going to shift gears a little bit. I noticed over the last couple of weeks, all we've been talking about is a Palladium, let's create a campaign idea, and we've been talking about bloat games, the Vigilante City and Vigilante Hack, and not that those are bad things, but there's so many other things I want to dive into. So what we're going to do is we're going to take a little bit of a break from the let's create a campaign idea. I want to come up with a few more things before I throw out the next poll, give a little bit more in-depth kind of background to that, and I will have some more content for Vigilante Hack and Vigilante City coming. But today I was kind of under a little bit of a time crunch. Normally I put out a couple of videos every Monday. Today, probably just one, maybe a shorter one later, depending on what happens. But today I wanted to focus on something that's been kind of near and dear. The idea of it has been sort of near and dear to my heart. But I'm fairly new to the game itself. And what I'm talking about today is Conan, the Adventures in an Age Undreamed of by Modipheus. This is the 2D20 game. This came out just, a year or so ago. And I'm kind of new to this system. And I'll talk about that a little bit in just a few minutes. So, why Conan? So my journey into the 2D20 system started when I was looking for the ultimate science fiction role-playing game. And you can see my video back a little bit further on the Star Trek Adventures game and my journey into trying to find the perfect for me and my group science fiction role-playing game. And I stumbled upon Star Trek Adventures, which is also a 2D20 game from Modipheus Entertainment. I've always been a fan of Conan the Barbarian. In fact, Robert E. Howard, the creator of Conan, one of my all-time favorite authors. I would say probably my favorite author of all time. There's a lot of videos out there talking about Conan, the role-playing game itself, and actual live plays and stuff, but nobody ever seems to explain who Robert E. Howard is and why this particular game is produced the way that it is. So I'm going to go back and give you a little bit of history on my history with Robert Howard, as well as who Robert Howard was himself. For me, it started, excuse me. For me, it started in probably the early 90s. A friend of mine in high school was actually reading a lot of pulpy science fiction, sword and sorcery kind of things. And I had been enthralled by those kind of things. I had been a big fan of fantasy, been a big fan of comic books and such. And I saw the cover of, I'm trying to remember what game or what book it was that he was reading at the time. Might have been Lovecraft or something. I'm not entirely sure which it was, but it encaptured me. I was really enthralled by the idea of this great covers by people like Frank Frazetta and Boris Vallejo and some of these classic sort of like heavy metal kind of covers and artwork and stuff. And so I began to kind of research into what I could find. What I stumbled upon was some of the Conan the Barbarian stories. But it wasn't until later that I found out that these were not the original stories, that these were stories that were written by other people after him, sort of his legacy. They were written after Howard had passed away and his vision had gone on, and other people were trying their hand at writing Conan stories. And while I thought those were great at the time, it wasn't until a few years later, it was roughly after college, end of college, that I actually fell upon actual, honest-to-God, Robert E. Howard, Conan the Barbarian stories. And I was blown away. I thought those other stories were good. Howard's stories were amazing. And I can understand now why his legacy couldn't have traveled on and on. The sad thing is that today most people don't remember him. We remember people like H.P. Lovecraft, who was a contemporary of his at the time, because Lovecraft is having this huge resurgence of fandom right now in, things like the Call of Cthulhu role-playing game and the popularity and pop culture of Cthulhu itself. So Lovecraft is sort of at an all-time popularity right now all-time high in popularity now, where Robert Howard doesn't get nearly as much attention, doesn't get nearly as much consideration as he should, I believe. And that's why I was so excited to see this game actually come out from Modipheus, and that they were actually using true, honest-to-God Robert E. Howard scholars to consult when putting this game together. Now, I've played a lot of other Conan the Barbarian role-playing games, namely the original D20 system, and then way back I did collect the original, I think it was 2nd edition AD&D, had come out with a few modules that were inspired by Conan stories, mostly the Conan movies, which, by the way, are not Howard. They're not Howard stories at all. They're not Howard creations at all. But I got a little bit obsessed. So most people remember Howard from Conan stories. Sorry, I'm shuffling books around here. But Del Rey Books a few years back came out with these. These are all of the collected works of Howard's original stories. And what's really awesome about these is that they took the time to even take the little partial stories, the fragments of stuff that he didn't complete, as well as essays by actual Howard scholars, and combined them into these three books. And it's an amazing collection. I know that these are still available. I know that these are still in print. So if you get a chance, please go grab these. These are amazing. But what most people don't realize is that Howard wrote hundreds of other stories, right? We're talking like Solomon Kane, which there's a great role-playing game out for through Savage Worlds for this. Kull the Conqueror, Exile of Atlantis. He wrote Bran Mac Morn. He wrote anything. And this is where I want to kind of get into who Robert E. Howard was, okay? Howard was born in Texas in 1906. And a small family. He had a father who traveled a lot. He was a traveling salesman, and left him home alone with his mother for long periods of time. And at one point, his father just didn't come home. Whether he abandoned his family or something had happened that wasn't really for certain, I believe. And Howard began to try to do lots of different odd jobs to try to support himself and his mother. And what he found that he really loved and what he really was passionate about was writing stories. And at the time, we're talking, now he's a grown man. So we're talking in the late 20s, mid 20s to the early 30s. And what was really popular at the time were pulp magazines. These were these magazines that were really, really cheap to buy for the common person to have. Because we're talking about like Depression era, we're talking just prior World War II, and so these pulp magazines were immensely popular because they were cheap. They're called pulp magazines because they were made out of pulpy paper, cheap ass paper that could be slapped together with these stories and be sold off for a nickel a piece for these different things. And there were dozens of them. There were dozens and dozens. There were romance stories. There were Western stories. There were detective stories. There's noir detective stories. And then what was new and exciting were these weird tales, right? And people like Howard and Lovecraft and some of the other contemporaries were starting to deliver these stories to these magazines. What was amazing about Howard was that there were certain he loved history, and he loved archaic, dark, maybe lost history, things that he could, imagine that are kind of lost to actual written history itself. And while he loved all those things, what he would do is he would write to these publishers and say, what are you looking for this month? What is it that's really popular? And they would come back and say, boxing stories are really, really popular right now for some reason. And Howard would say, fine, I'll crank 6 of them out for you. And he would send in these stories. And no matter what it was, he could do it, and he could do it very, very well. Whether Western stories or romance stories, or boxing stories. But what he really loved was taking history, like Bran Mac Morn was his character that was a Pict. He was a weird, wild warrior of Celtic descent. and he wrote dozens of stories about him as well too. And would create all these stories, but what he was best known for was Conan the Barbarian. And it's a funny story, because he created Kull the Conqueror first, right? Kull, the exile of Atlantis, the king. And he sent those stories in, and they didn't do so well. They kept getting rejected. So the funny thing is he actually took a Kull story, changed the name of the places, and changed Kull to Conan, and it was an instant success. His popularity began to grow. People began to talk. And what was great about that time period is that there were no real threats of copyright infringement at the time. These guys, particularly Howard and Lovecraft, loved to share their ideas. It wasn't until years later when the whole idea of sort of like crunching down on a copyright and you can't use my stuff, how dare you, I'll sue you for using any of my ideas, came into being. Howard and Lovecraft wrote numerous letters back and forth to each other, and while a lot of them were arguing back and forth about what true horror was or the political climate of the day and stuff, a lot of times they were sharing ideas. And if you read some of the horror stories that Robert Howard wrote, you'll see a huge influence from Lovecraft over to him. You'll see lots and lots and lots of names that are very familiar shared back and forth. And so it was a great time when authors were just wanting to share their ideas and share their dreams and their work with other authors, and to see those stories sort of come to life. It was almost like the Forgotten Realms in D&D. It was a shared world experience, right? Hey, I came up with this really cool character. What kind of stories can you tell using that same character? Or these same ideas? And so it was a really interesting time period for all these things. The sad thing is that Howard was a very eccentric individual. And it was said in a memoir written by, and I always forget her name. Howard dated a woman for a while, and she wrote a memoir about him after he died. And according to her, he was a very eccentric writer. And in fact, he would sit at a typewriter in his home with his mother in Cross Plains, Texas, and he would act out all the scenes as he was writing them. So that meant the times that he was like yelling and pounding away on the keyboard. If he wanted to try to get a sword fight or a fist fight just right for his story, he would call some friends over and they would reenact them in his front yard. So he was a very passionate individual, a very strong-willed writer, and was very passionate about his works. But in that, he was also very passionate about his mother, and his mother became sick, and she passed away. And it was too much for him. It was too overwhelming, being such a passionate person that he was, that he committed suicide in 1936. And we lost what I believe, in my opinion, one of the greatest pulp writers of all time. He's been known as the father of sword and sorcery fiction, and I think the title is rightfully given to him, because he really redefined what sword and sorcery fiction is, and what it is that we still sort of refer to today when we think of sword and sorcery. So I've tried a lot of different Conan games, and what is it about this one that seems to be so fantastic? Well, aside from the fact, that's what I'm trying to say, that it is been referenced Howard scholars to actually try to fit his original vision of the game, and not all the other stuff that's come out later. Some of it was good. I know Robert Jordan, the guy who's most famous for The Eye of the World and that series of books, Wheel of Time series, he wrote several Conan novels, and they were decent. There were several others, that Lynn Carter, who written several of them as well too. Some good, some not so good. There are a lot of turds out there as well too. But the stuff that Howard wrote was very, very amazing. And there were lots of pieces and bits that he wrote that were just never finished. And so these guys, when Modipheus wanted to make this game, they went straight to the source. They went straight to the scholars who had studied him his entire life to create this game. And what they came out with was an amazing, amazing product. This book is beautiful. Not only in the scope that it's told through Howard's original visions, but they've also gathered some of the best artists in the market who have ever done sort of Conan-inspired artwork before, and to capture the vision of this book. We're talking Frank Frazetta, and we're talking Boris Vallejo, and numerous others. Aside from the book being just beautiful, and aside from the book being, inspired by Howard's true original stories, the thing I was most worried about going into this game was the 2d20 system. The first and only time I had ever encountered the 2d20 system was in Star Trek Adventures. And I was amazed by how well it worked for Star Trek, and to tell stories of space exploration and diplomacy and space combat, and how it kind of fits with that. Now, because that being my only experience with 2d20, I was a little wary, because it told space stories. It told crunchy, hard science fiction stories very, very well. So how would it deal with sword and sorcery? What I wasn't aware of is that 2d20 system is actually just sort of a framework, and that each one of these games takes the 2d20 framework and expounds upon it and changes it. So the 2d20 system that's in Conan the Barbarian, or Conan the role-playing game, is different, air quotes, than the one that's in Star Trek Adventures. While the basis of it, the framework is the same, this game uses it to a different effect. And I think it captures the sword and sorcery genre amazingly well. I'm super excited about this game. And in fact, just yesterday I ordered a bunch of the supplements that have already come out for it. And I'll get into that in a minute, and the way that they're doing the supplements is really amazing. One of the great things about the way the 2d20 system fits in this book is because a lot, if not all, of the stories of Conan were focused on Conan himself. And there were times when he would have, sidekicks, or would have people that would go on adventures with him. For the most part, they were stories about him and how he was sort of the perfect everyman. He was the every hero, right? He was a barbarian, and he was a lover, and he was a thief, and he was king at one point, a pirate. And so he covered all these things, and he was good at all of them, right? He's the sort of Hemingway of sword and sorcery characters. And so a lot of the stories focus just upon him and his exploits. What's really cool about this game is that you can play it that way if you prefer. I believe that this game works just as well with one game master and one player as it does with one game master and 5 players. There's such a wealth of opportunity and place and space to tell these kinds of stories in a sword and sorcery setting. Now, you've heard me say sword and sorcery over and over and over again in this video, and you're probably asking yourself, Questwise, what do you mean by sword and sorcery? Sword and sorcery, to me, and this varies. I mean, the genre definitions across all of fiction, they vary so greatly depending on sort of personal preference. But to me, sword and sorcery is a gritty, human-centric sort of story where might is stronger, like the power of steel is stronger than the power of sorcery, right? Magic exists, but it exists because it's fueled by usually the villains. It's a dangerous proposition to undertake. Its corruption ability is very high. It's not an easy thing to learn. Magic is very tough and must be done through rituals and sometimes human sacrifices. It corrupts anything it touches. It can be deadly for anything it touches. But it provides great power, and it provides that sort of allure. I'd also, to me, sword and sorcery is the idea of the quest, the idea of there being things out there that are lost and hidden that you must go and search for, and those things provide great wealth and great power, and I think through the eyes of Conan provide happiness, right? You'll see through these stories that Conan will go out and accomplish his task and come home with, this major jewels and be rich for like one story, and the next story begins with him being completely, poor and living in the streets, and he's blown it all. And to Conan, I think that was happiness. It was that sort of roller coaster ride of a high adventure, which equaled wealth and great fame, and then the bottomless pits of spending all that wealth and great fame to bring you back to poverty and such. So we're talking about over the top, very heroic types of adventures and stuff. This game captures it in spades. Like, it does it very, very well. And the 2D20 system and the way that they present it in this book does it amazingly well. And I can't wait to dive into some of these supplements. Now, supplements, I've been talking about, what Modipheus is doing is that they're sort of, they've offered an adventure book, which I'll put up some screenshots up here of those. But what they're doing is they're taking every aspect of Conan throughout the stories, and they're providing you with more options for players to play within those options. So there's a supplement called Conan the Barbarian, and Conan the Thief, and Conan the Mercenary, and Conan the Pirate, right? And there's going to be a bunch of others as well, too. And they're taking each aspect of what Conan was throughout his life, and they're giving you more and more options to play as player characters. Do you want to play in a, Conan the Thief was the first one, I believe, that came out, supplemental-wise, and in it you can play an assassin, or you can dig deeper into the thief class. You can play, sultry merchant kind of thing. So there's a lot of different options coming out, and I think it's genius how they're doing it, as sort of breaking it down by the different aspects of Conan throughout his entire life and breadth of the stories that Robert Howard wrote. I've watched a lot of videos on the scholars themselves, doing talks about Conan the role-playing game, or talking about just Robert Howard himself. There's also a very fantastic video, and I'll link to it down below in the notes, where these scholars are brought together to try out the playtest of the Conan role-playing game, playing it in Robert E. Howard's original house in Cross Plains, Texas, which is now preserved as a historical site and can be gone to and toured as a mini museum to his life as well, too. So if you haven't tried out the Conan the role-playing game, Conan 2D20, or as its official long title, Robert E. Howard's Conan, Adventures in an Age Undreamed Of, by Modipheus Publishing, you got to try it. If you're a fan of sword and sorcery, if you're a fan of Conan himself, or of any of Howard's works, there's a possibility in this to even run more horror stories that were inspired through Lovecraft into Howard's works as well, too. Beautiful, beautiful stuff. I can't say enough about this game. Super excited about sharing it with more people, and I will do a review of every supplement that comes through. We're going to make this kind of a series, so it's going to be kind of a scattered series because I've got them coming in at various times. But once they come in and I get them read, I will do reviews of each of the supplements as well, too, which I found was a little bit lacking online. There's only one other person I could find on YouTube that are actually talking about the supplements to this game as well, too. So until next time, I'm Questwise, and I am out.